But new strains of wheat have increased yields, and this farmer is looking forward to a good year.
ثلاثة كنتال فرق عن حدا جزء أنت صب نحنا لوت أنت لو أنت تأفقن كل تخلتال فرق عن كل تخلتال.
From the countryside to the cities, Ethiopia is in the middle of the biggest transformation in its long history. Cycles of drought and famine have long played a role in Ethiopia's politics. In 1974, a terrible famine resulted in the overthrow of Emperor Haile Selassie. His death at the hands of a ruthless military dictatorship ended a long line of emperors going back to King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. But the bloody crackdowns of Mengistu Haile Mariam's military regime, or Derg, sparked a new wave of rebellion. Among the rebels, a smart young man from Tigray called Meles Zenawi. Initially, the rebels were given little chance of success. At 14, Meles won a scholarship to a prestigious school named after World War II guerrilla warfare expert Ord Wingate. Instead, Meles Zenawi would sacrifice that future for another, emerging from the long years of rebellion as a skilled and pragmatic politician.
These were urban boys who had been raised with some privilege in Addis Ababa, and to find themselves living out in the hills of Tigray with no money, with no resources, in fear of their lives, relying on the local peasantry to sustain them, and yet to continue the ideological debate, because I know that that happened. It's an extraordinary legend. This handful of students brought their ideas out into the wilderness of northern Tigray, and that they relied on the local peasantry to feed them, to sustain them, until they decided that it was time to begin the insurrection. And they did this by raiding one police station where they picked up several guns, and they were able to begin raiding passing traffic and to recruit people.
It was in the mountains of Tigray that Aidan Hartley, then a young reporter for the news agency Reuters, got to know the rebels and Meles.
I met a very unassuming, quite young man. He looked like a cafe au lait Lenin, and he was smoking heavily. That's what I remember from my first meeting with him. I had no idea who he was. And he said, "My name is Meles Zenawi, and you're going to go to Tigray starting tomorrow, and good luck."
While Meles himself was little known to the outside world, his grasp of both ideology and military tactics had already elevated him to the top ranks of the rebellion's secretive leadership circles.
When he was running a guerrilla group in the mountains of Tigray, he knew that the most effective way to rule was through the authoritarian apparatus of a Marxist-Leninist League of Tigray. And he knew by the time that he arrived in Addis Ababa that he had to speak the language that would make sense to the West and the international community. But he did it in a very charming way. He announced to the world that he had enrolled in a correspondence course learning economics.
But it was in these mountains of Tigray that another event would unfold, one which would get the world's attention.
This was a situation in Tigray during the dark period, suffering of the people, and the drought, war, and all that. The dark regime was hampering aid from reaching, actually, especially the countryside. It was terrible. This is me.
Tewodros Hagos was an early comrade of Meles in the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, or TPLF.
It was not easy. It was very, very tough, especially during when the organization was small. They had to strive very hard for its survival, and eventually, since the cause it was fighting for was a cause which the people were supporting, the people started to support it. Actually, eventually, the people became part of the struggle as a whole.
Caught in a famine and between warring armies, it was the peasants whom the rebels relied on for support that suffered the worst during the famine of the 1980s.
People that had become my family, the small-scale farmers on whose generosity I and many of my colleagues depended for our daily bread, they were very severely affected, and that affected our movement also.
Thousands died while the Derg, who could have helped, did little. News reports on the famine helped launch one of the biggest aid efforts ever.
It came a bit late, but it did serve to save millions of lives, because the international community responded very quickly and very generously to the famine.
In May 1991, Derg forces disintegrated, and within days, rebel forces, including Meles, TPLF, captured Addis Ababa. But the secretive habits of a rebel leader remained. An extremely private man, his reasoning and that of his party has always raised questions.
To get to the bottom of the character of Meles and of his guerrilla group, his party, his movement, you have to go up into the northern Ethiopian highlands.
Adwa, Meles' hometown in Tigray province, provided some of the strength that made him an effective warrior. It is the location of a famous defeat of an Italian colonial army in 1896.
And they were defeated and driven back through Eritrea, that is through Massawa, and they left.
Fiseha Zenawi and his friend Fanas Bire have come to look at the valleys outside Adwa where the battle took place.
First, in the Ethiopian history, a white man was captured by the black people. Oh, it is not only for the Ethiopian people, for all the black people to defeat well-trained army. It is a big victory, see. It is a big history. And they have kept their country for a long period of time, independently.
The town that Meles Zenawi experienced as a child can still be recognized in the Adwa of today. A short walk from the family home is an Ethiopian Orthodox church whose complex and ancient ceremonies begin each day at 5 a.m.
ያው ዝካዚ ክቡር ጠቅላይ ሚኒስትር መለስ ዜናዊ ብሞት ምፍላይ ዝረኸቦ ጽዕንቶ የለን ነገር ግን እንታይ እዩ እቲ ዘሕዝኖን ዘውክየን ፍቅሩ ብወህያ ዘግልጾ ምክንያት ግን ክቡር ጠቅላይ ሚኒስትር መጀመርያ ተሒዙ ስለ ህዝቢ ኢሉ ተወጊሱ ስለ ህዝቢ ኢሉ ሞይቱ ሕዝቡን ስለ ህዝቢ ኢሉ እንዳተጓያ እንዳሃለወ ብዘይ ምንም ዕረፍቲ ሞቱ ዳዩ እቲ ጠንካራ ወይ ከዓ መሪር ሓዘን ኮይኑ ስሙዕ እምበር ክቡር ጠቅላይ ሚኒስትር ተሞተ ያው ተመሰረታት ናይ ልምዓት ይኹን ተመሰረታት ናይ ዲሞክራሲ ይኹን ሓንፂፅዎ ስለ ዝኸደን ክቡር ጠቅላይ ሚኒስትር ብምፍላይ ምንም ብዙሕ ስሙዕ ሰበል ይብልን ነገር ግን ንሃቱ ዕረፍቲ ዘይምርኣይ ከዓ ብጣዕሚ ሓዘንተኛ እዩ
The spirituality he experienced here helped Meles make the transition from warrior to statesman, from someone whose responsibility went from taking his enemies' lives to making his fellow citizens' lives better.
Perhaps that's a metaphor that describes how Ethiopian society could withdraw up into its mountain fastnesses. They're dry, deforested, hauntingly beautiful. These extraordinary steep-sided mountains known as ambers, like Inselbergs, something out of a fantasy movie. You get the sense that this is a landscape that has been tilled for many centuries. It's a landscape that feels almost medieval, where you meet Christian hermits, where you see ancient tombs, extraordinary monuments to former kings.
Is typical of the region. New buildings dot the roadside, but it's a byway of the old town that holds the Zenawi family home.
He was really born in this house, and he learned up to grade 8. Then after grade 8 there was an exam, he got scholarship to General Wingate School. When he was childhood, his hobbies were one, swimming, next, reading books. From childhood, he was reading so many books. So I think if you read too much, you get too much knowledge, you know to whom to help. He was not born for himself and for his family. He was selfless. So I cannot say that he was not born for himself. Adwa was built first around here. So we can say this is the oldest part of the town. They have already left it for museum, as a museum, old town.
Something that clearly has changed is the water level in the rivers where the boys used to swim.
This is one of the rivers where he was swimming when he was a childhood. Now it's a little bit dry. Before it was as full as this part. Now it's a little bit dry. But when we were kids, it was not like this. The water was very full up to this one. And he used to swim around here. But now almost all because of the drought, because of, of the climatical condition, most of the rivers are dry.
Years later, Meles Zenawi would champion Africa's efforts to mitigate climate change.
We need to do more work in terms of irrigation and encourage these pastoralists to settle. That takes time because the livelihoods of the population is based on livestock and movement around. And it's not easy to change their attitude towards settled farming. The drought has been more acute in the east. I think this is related to climate change. The climatologists have been telling us that the rest of the country, the highland area of the country, is likely to get wetter.
በናይ አፍሪካ ወኪል ብርቱዕ ሚና ብምፅዋት ኣነ ደስ ይለኒ እንደገና ናይ አፍሪካ ወኪል ምፅዋት ማለት መለስስ ክንደየናይ ፍልጠት ከም ዝነበረን ክንደየናይ ተኣማኒ ከም ዝነበረን ኣስፊሕ ክገልጽ ደል መለስ ካብ ቀደም ጀሚሩ ጽቡቕ ስራሕትታት ከም ዝሰርሕ ነበረ እንደገና ብዓለም ደረጃ እውን ክፍለጥ ወለድ ኢኮኖሚክ ፎርም ዝበሃል
Elected Prime Minister in the first ever democratic election in 1995, Meles would continue to keep Ethiopia's peasants at the center of his economic policies.
We have developed what we call agricultural development-led industrialization program of our country. That was not necessarily popular or well understood when we embarked on it some 10 years ago. But now people recognize that agricultural prices are going up and are likely to continue to go up over the next decade or two, and that agricultural modernization centered on the small-scale farmer spreads out whatever development benefit there is. And so, for example, Ethiopia is, however poor we are, we share our poverty more equally than anybody in the continent. And so whatever little grows there is, it's broadly shared.
The massive famines of the previous century were brought to an end, and a huge program of food security for the country's peasants, known as a safety net program, was rolled out.
We have a safety net program throughout the country, and so those that are unable to feed themselves as a result of their own effort are provided with assistance in return for doing some work in the community and in their own farms. So they may be engaged in rural road development programs and they will be paid for their work. We call it a productive safety net program because people have to work for it in order to get the safety net, but they're guaranteed that they will be paid. So that has reduced the number of people who need emergency assistance. 7-8 million people get benefit from the safety net program throughout the country and in Tigray.
مالناس يعني بوتا خايفة بوتا خايفة كيف صار التعدي قدفنا أنا ومعناتنا نقدمنا كنا وجز البوتا كنا حزين معنا جز البوتا أي خالدية ما يمشي بها عدي يجو خالدية يقدميه مريت كيف تشيل وعيد كيوستو كيباشو إننا نقدم بوتا أنا نقدم عمل كنا نقدم أنا نقدم زعلنا معاه فأنا هات ما يكون حاجة سوي يكون ينمعي يقعز نقدمنا نحن معنا نحن نقدم عمل معنا خالدية يوفريه ينمعي أبغى ما نيرو ننمع أبغى عندما بدنبي كوعتنا خلينا بدن بنوصو بوتا وحج كي شلنا نقدو بوتا نقدم هنا.
الشغاوة اللي الحرمين عتواجد كنت عن تصلت البداية كم زبلني كوميديا زرينا ينفتنا ما أعرف كوميديا يزرعنا قرية زرينا ينفتي قرية مزرعنا.
But bringing the countryside into the 21st century was a slow, expensive business.
We have an emergency reserve food here in country. So if there's an emergency, we don't have to wait for food to arrive from abroad. We take from the emergency reserve and provide the food assistance to those who need it.
Meles defied the international community by placing the peasantry and the countryside at the center of his policies, a move that led to much unhappiness and criticism of him from the cities.
That criticism seems to me misplaced. He believed that Ethiopia is a diverse society. You know, there are diverse religions, diverse ethnic groups, diverse economic interests prevailing in the country. So he believed that no single party will satisfy these people. No single ideology or no single political alternative will satisfy this public. This is the first thing. So based on the diversity, he said to himself and to his party that we have to nurture diversity and allow diversity to be expressed in any form.
Dissatisfaction in the cities also spread to outlying areas where minorities felt excluded.
The Amhara were not happy, the Oromo were not happy, the Somalis weren't happy.
But to the outside world, Ethiopia under Meles appeared to be on a road, albeit a bumpy one, to modernity. In 2005, opposition parties in the cities united against Meles, shocking his ruling party to the core. When election results were contested, the opposition took to the streets and a violent crackdown saw opposition members killed, jailed, or exiled.
Particularly after 2005 elections, he's more known to the dissident circles of Ethiopians that are by large in diaspora right now, and also to many political opposition parties known to be a merciless an autocrat, who has so little patience and accommodation to any dissidents that were happening.
Sedale Lema is a media entrepreneur and one of the few independent media owners in Addis Ababa.
Internationally, he was indisputably a very shrewd politician that's known not only in the continent in Africa but also outside of the continent for his unwavering support to peace and security in the Horn of Africa, and his diplomatic skills are indisputably one of the best. So he has two different personalities, and hence the contention about who he really was.
Change in Ethiopia's urban centers has sped up. Opening up of the private